Hello everyone and welcome to another video. There are two main ways to make money in Rollercoaster Tycoon, which are by charging for the park entrance and by charging for the rides. The first one is quite simple and is often limited by how much cash the guests spawn with, but knowing what to charge for your rides is quite a bit more complicated. That is why in this video I will explain exactly how the maximum ticket price is calculated, and I will also include some tips and tricks to make it yourself as easy as possible. Some of you may think, hang on, didn't you already make this video? And yes, I did, a little over 6 years ago. However, because I did not properly understand everything yet, it was split into two different parts, with part 2 correcting some stuff in part 1. Also, since it's quite an old video, I didn't go into too much depth, and the information in those videos is now outdated as well, so an updated version is necessary. You see, for the past 8 years, the very popular RCT2 has been using a different formula to calculate the maximum ticket price and also the park value for very new rides than the official vanilla games. That is why in quite a few of my videos that talk about these things I clarify the difference between RCT2 and the other games. But that change has been reversed now and it all works the same again from RCT2 version 0.4.27 and onwards. We'll talk about what this change was, what the impact of it were and why it was done later, but let's first see how the maximum ride ticket price is now calculated in Rollercoaster Tycoon 1, 2, Classic and RCT2. It is quite common knowledge that you can charge more for big rides like roller coasters than for a small ride like a Ferris wheel. While you can't charge more than a few bucks for a flat ride, some big coasters can go up to 15 or even 20 euros per guest. This difference makes intuitive sense, but what actually causes it? The main factors are the excitement, intensity and nausea ratings of your ride. The higher these are, the more you can charge. Since roller coasters tend to have very high stats, you can charge a lot for them. However, if you have two different ride types with identical stats, it's not necessarily the case that they also have the same maximum ticket price, as there's also a second factor considering some hidden values. Every ride type in the game has a so-called excitement value, intensity value and nausea value, and these are different and separate from the actual ride stats. For example, the values for the junior coaster are 50 for excitement, 30 for intensity and 10 for nausea. These determine how much each of these three stats contribute to the ticket price, with the excitement contributing the most, then intensity, and lastly the nausea contributing only a little bit. This may all be a bit confusing, so let's have a look at some examples, starting with this junior coaster. It has 4.99 excitement, 5.48 intensity, and 3.54 nausea. These all need to be multiplied by 100 and then their respective values, which are, as we saw before, 50, 30 and 10. You get some pretty big numbers out of this, and you now divide these by 1024 and round them down to the nearest whole number. This results in 24, 16 and 3. Now add them together for a preliminary ride value of 43. You can see that despite the intensity rating being the highest of the three, it's actually the excitement that contributes the most to this number of 43, as the multiplier value for the excitement is nearly twice as high as that for the intensity. As rides get older, their value drops, so now we have to apply the age value to this number. When a ride is brand new, you simply add 30 to it, getting us to 73, but once it turns 5 months old, you only add 10, making the ride value 53. Another year later, at 13 months, you do nothing, and after that you start multiplying the input by smaller and smaller numbers, giving you lower and lower values. This goes all the way down from 73 when it's brand new to just 3 when this coaster turns 128 months or 16 years old. However, once it reaches an age of 200 months, it becomes a classic and becomes worth a bit more again, but not as much as it was when it was new. Keep in mind that there are only 8 months in a year in this game, so 200 months is 25 years, and 13 months is 1 year and 5 months. To convert this ride value to the maximum ticket price you can charge, you need to divide it by 5, which for this ride gets us to 14 euros and 60 cents when it's brand new. This then over time goes down to 10 euros 60, 8.60, 6.40 and so on. If you're using a different currency, then you may also need to multiply it by 10, 100 or 1000 depending on what exchange rate it has. Dollars, pounds and euros are all the same, but when you're using for example the Japanese yen, this 8.6 changes to 860 as 1 euro is 100 yen in this game. I've been playing this park for about 3.5 years and placed this coaster near the beginning, so it's in the third age category, making the maximum ticket price €8.60. You can also see on the right window that it says it was built 3 years ago, which means it's between 3 and 4 years old. We can verify that this ticket price is correct by charging exactly this amount and then increasing the price by 10 cents, which makes all the guests suddenly stop going and start complaining about how it's too expensive now. When a ride gets too expensive, this goes for every single guest in the park. There is no sliding scale, no percent chance, just a yes or no. There is a way to get guests to pay more than they would usually do, which we'll discuss later, but then it's still a case of when this happens they don't check the price, instead of it being a random chance. There are still 2 ways that this ride can become worth less than €8.60. The first is by building another junior coaster in the same park. When we do this, all the prices go down by 25% and we can only charge €6.60 instead of €8.60. The reason it's not exactly a quarter less has to do with the fact that we again round down to integers. To calculate the value that needs to be subtracted, this value of 43 is divided by 4 and rounded down to 10, leaving us with 33. So while sometimes you will lose exactly a quarter of the value, it can also be a little bit less. The rule for this is that if you have 2 or more of the same ride type in the park, all rides of that type get this penalty and lose 25% of their value. Now, this works ever so slightly differently in Vanilla and Classic compared to OpenRCT2. Right now, here in the original Rollercoaster Tycoon 2, guests are happily paying €7.50 for this tiny maze with a fun surprise at the end. But as soon as I start constructing a second maze, it's suddenly too expensive as there is now a second maze in the park, despite it still only being a concept hanging around in the ether. It works the same in RCT Classic, but in OpenRCT2 the ride has to actually be open for it to count. So you can start building the second ride of the same type and test it, and only once you open it, the other one, and also this one, will get the penalty. The other difference is that originally some distinct ride types were actually still the same type according to the code. This goes for the corkscrew and the hypercoaster, it goes for the twister and the hyper twister, and the steel wild mouse and spinning wild mouse. In RCT1, 2 and Classic, these pairs are considered the same ride type and will lower each other's maximum ticket prices, but in OpenRCT2 they're now considered different types, which does make more sense. However, just changing the trains doesn't make it a different ride type. So for example, a twister coaster, a stand-up twister coaster and a floorless coaster are still the same type, even in OpenRCT2. The final influence on the maximum ticket price is whether the guest has paid to get into the park or not. This is impossible in RCT2 or Classic, but in RCT1 and OpenRCT2 you can sometimes charge for both the park entry and the rides at the same time. If you do this, then the maximum price that guests are willing to pay for the rides goes down by 75%, so the maximum for our junior coaster goes down from €8.60 to just €2. This time we lose more than the advertised amount, as the ride value of 43 is first divided by 4 to 10.75 and then rounded down to 10, which corresponds to a maximum ticket price of €2. This penalty is on a per guest basis, so if you charge for the park entry and then make it free, the guests will still only want to pay very little, but new guests that did not pay to get into the park will pay the full price for your rides. Okay, quick summary. First, the excitement, intensity and nausea ratings are multiplied by 100 and then their respective value for the type that the ride is. Then you divide these by 1024, round down to the nearest whole number and add them together. This result gets put through the age algorithm, as rides lose value when they get older. After that they will lose another 25% of value if you have more than one of this ride type in your park, and 75% of the value if you're also charging for the park entry. Let's do another example, this time with this very foresty merry-go-round. It has 1.7 for excitement, 0.6 intensity and 0.75 nausea. The stat values of the merry-go-round are 50, 10 and 0, meaning the nausea rating does not provide anything. Multiplying the stats with 100 and their values and then dividing them by 1024 gives it 8, 0 and 0 for a combined value of, well, just 8. This results in these possible maximum ticket prices, depending on the age of the ride. You'll notice that it starts out with a pretty decent €7.60, but then immediately falls off by more than 50% after just 5 months, and then again after 13 months. This is because the age algorithm always adds the same value to new rides, 30 and 10 respectively, which can become a very large portion of the ticket price if the ride itself has low stats. In fact, if you don't have multiple of this type in the park and you're not charging for the entrance, then this simply adds 6 and 2 euros respectively, or 4.5 and 1.5 if you do have multiple in the park. The default price for this merry-go-round is just €1.60, so that's 6 euros extra and nearly quintuples that ride price to €7.60. This is great, and it means that for very new flat rides you can charge a surprising amount of money, but they will also lose a lot of value very quickly. Every ride in your park loses 4 euros of value when they turn 5 months old and another 2 when they turn 13 months old, or 3 and 1.5 respectively if you got multiple in the park. That is a lot for our merry-go-round, as it goes from 760 to just 360 to just 160, but for rides with higher stats it's not so bad. Our junior coaster from earlier loses a much smaller portion of its value, as it goes from 1460 to 1060 to 860, losing only 41% after 13 months. With these two examples you can clearly see the difference in ride value between a ride with low stats and a ride with much higher stats, but we should also take a look at the differences between the stat values of the different ride types. If you remember, the junior coaster has values of 50, 30 and 10 here, which are incredibly common. A lot of different coaster types and a few other ride types have exactly these values. So a junior coaster, mini suspended coaster, magic carpet and mini golf that all have the exact same stats will also have the same maximum ticket price. When it is different, it's usually not too different. Some coasters have 52, 36 and 10, which is a little bit higher. The Ferris wheel has 60, 20 and 10, the reverse coaster has 48, 28 and 7 and so on. There are a few exceptions though. The absolute lowest stat values belong to the space rings with a god-awful 12, 4 and 4. This means that even though it has a massive 6.5 nausea rating, it only has a base ride value of 3, less than half of the already low 8 of the merry-go-round. When it's new, the ticket price is propped up by that flat boost of 6 and 2 euros, but after 13 months guests already don't want to pay more than 60 cents, and after 13 years they literally don't want to pay anything at all. Its low excitement, very high nausea and terrible throughput already make the space rings the worst ride in the game, but the super low ride ticket price makes it even worse. You can improve it a little bit by building some scenery around it, like I did here, which boosts the ride value from 3 to 4. Yeah, it makes pretty much no difference. On almost all other ride types, scenery can increase the maximum ticket price by a decent amount, but the space rings is screwed either way. There are a few more flat rides with very low stat values, but those all have better actual stats and a better throughput than the space rings. On the other side of the spectrum, there are 3 water ride types with stat values of 80, 34 and 6, meaning you can charge a lot for them even though their stats are quite low. These are the log flume, river rafts and splash boats, with the lift, observation tower and the river rapids having slightly lower but still high values as well. This is a big part of why the log flume and the river rapids are such good moneymakers, despite their relatively low stats. The splash boats is even better, as it can get quite a high excitement rating. It also has a ridiculous capacity of 16 guests per boat. This allows you to get to the maximum possible ticket price of 20 euros and a very high throughput quite easily. There is one ride type that completely destroys all of these though, and that is the go-karts with stat values of 120, 20 and 0. This is so ridiculously high that even for this medium-sized go-kart you can charge 21 euros and 60 cents for the first 5 months. Well, actually just 20, since that's the highest you can charge for any ride or stall, but guests would pay more if you could charge more. It's a shame the go-kart has a very low throughput of just a few hundred guests an hour, otherwise it would be a fantastic moneymaker. Although I guess for the sake of balance it's probably a good thing. You may have noticed that so far every ride we have discussed has its excitement value the highest, then the intensity and lastly the nausea. Some types may have 2 of these the same, such as the 70, 10 and 10 for the car ride, but never is intensity higher than nausea or nausea higher than intensity. There are though 2 exceptions to this rule. The air-powered vertical coaster and reverse freefall coaster both have values of 44, 66 and 10. This means that their intensity contributes the most to the ticket price instead of the excitement rating. Since they are quite intense and tend to have at least 7 intensity, this always results in a high maximum ticket price. These 2 rather small designs result in 19 and 19.4 euros respectively for the first 5 months, thanks to their super high intensity ratings and values. The final weird thing about stat values belongs to the miniature railway, monorail and suspended monorail. These all have a value of -10 for their nausea, meaning that a higher nausea rating results in a lower ticket price. However, these rides have such an incredibly low nausea rating that this will only ever result in -1 ride value, subtracting at most 20 cents from the maximum ticket price. Before we take a look at the optimal pricing strategy and which rides are the best moneymakers, let's talk about what OpenRCT2 did differently for 8 years. In 2017 it was decided that being able to charge at least €6 for a very new ride, no matter how bad the stats were, was weird and unbalanced, so the +30 and +10 for the first two age categories were removed and replaced with a ×1.5 and ×1.2 instead. The idea of this was that high value rides still get a significant bonus for being new, but low value rides stay low value. And it worked for what it was intended to do, as our merry-go-round went down from a maximum ticket price of €7.60 when it was brand new to just €2.40, and also from €3.60 in the next stage to just €1.80. This is because instead of flat out adding 6 and €2, you're now multiplying the base of €1.6 by 1.5 and 1.2 respectively, which doesn't add very much. While flat rides with low stats like this one got the biggest nerf, a lot of other rides got nerfed too. Our junior coaster lost some value when it's new as well, although this time it's not as big of a difference. It's only the most valuable rides that gained some value from this change. This big twister coaster went from 19.2 and 15.2 euros in the vanilla system to 19.8 and 15.8 euros in the old OpenRCT2 system. And this launched freefall went from 21.6 and 17.6 to 23.4 and 18.6 euros. However, since you cannot charge more than 20 euros anyway, there was only a small value gain of 1 euro during the second age stage, which is not very much. So this change that OpenRCT2 had nerfed most rides, with low stat rides being hit very hard, and gave a very small boost to a couple of rides with high stats. After 13 months there were no differences anymore, as those age values remained untouched. This all goes for the park value too, by the way. The usually about 70% of your total park value that comes from the ride stat uses the same ride value in the way we calculated it here, and thus was also influenced by this change in OpenRCT2 in the same way. This means that in the vanilla games, and now again in OpenRCT2 as well, spamming flat rides to get a quick park value boost is quite a viable strategy. The intention of this change was to nerf rides with very low stats, but it of course also has the downside of losing parity with RCT2 Vanilla and Classic. And there's also the fact that the nerf was probably a bit too harsh, especially for rides with low stats and stat values. I mean, previously you could charge €6.60 for a brand new crooked house, and now just 80 cents, which is so low that OpenRCT2 also had to change the default ticket price of a few rides, as those values were above what you could now charge for a new ride with a new formula. And really, if you look at it more closely, rides with low stats are still a lot worse than roller coasters. Sure, we can charge more than €7 for this merry-go-round for a little while, but that's still only about half of what we can charge for this small junior coaster, and the throughput of the merry-go-round is terrible as well. New flat rides are a lot better than what I've been used to for the past 8 years, but they're still vastly outperformed by things like roller coasters. For example, even though its fairly empty queue line shows that it's not at its maximum capacity yet, this new mine train coaster has more than triple the profit of the new swinging ship across the street, and the swinging ship is already one of the better flat rides. For this reason, it was decided to revert this change, which makes me very happy, as any differences between OpenRCT2 and the official games are things I will have to explain every single time, and it makes things more complicated. Alright, now that we know how exactly the maximum ride ticket price is calculated, let's discuss what the optimal strategy is. Yes, we can just calculate it and adjust it accordingly, but keeping up with changing the ride ticket price of every single ride in your park when it enters a new age category becomes infeasible pretty quickly. Therefore, it's useful to have some rules of thumb. One that I use is to not bother with changing the price of flat rides at all and only focus on optimizing the few big rides in your park. This is much easier to keep up with, and the flat rides aren't making you that much anyway. But how do you know how much you can charge? Well, you could go through the lengthy process of calculating it yourself or increasing the price until guests no longer want to pay for it, but there is a quicker way. If you're using OpenRCT2, then you can download this plugin that I made, which automatically calculates the maximum ticket prices of any ride in your park. You can select a ride either with the drop down or with the ride picker tool, and it will automatically calculate the maximum ticket price for every age category. It displays it in whatever currency you're using and highlights the correct maximum price for the age category the ride is currently in. It also has an option to automatically update the input, so if you build a second ride of the same type or you increase the excitement rating by building scenery around the ride, it will keep up with that and recalculate the maximum ticket prices accordingly. You can also theorize with this plugin by making up some input yourself. For example, if you only have one wooden coaster in your park and are wondering what the maximum prices would be if you built a second one, then you can disable the auto update and manually tick that checkbox. You can also make up any ride with any stats, such as a space race with 10 excitement or a dinghy slide with 6.66 in every stat. It works with all the new ride types introduced in OpenRCT2 as well, and I will update this whenever another new ride type gets added. Do be aware that the results will only be correct in OpenRCT2 version 0.4.27 and onwards, as before that OpenRCT2 still uses that other algorithm for new rides that we talked about. The plugin still functions in these older versions, but especially on low value flat rides, the prices it lists for under 5 and 13 months old will be quite inaccurate. Also, I should say that while I did design this plugin and did a lot of the programming, I could not have done it without the help of the great TiggerSec90. I wanted to make this plugin, but I had no idea how to make a plugin, so I asked in the OpenRCT2 Discord server if anyone was willing to help me make one. TiggerSec said yes, and he taught me how to do it. He created the GitHub page for it and showed me how to work with GitHub. He also coded up a basic skeleton of the plugin for me to start with. You see, I had never coded in TypeScript or even JavaScript before, and I had also never worked with the OpenRCT2 plugin ecosystem either, so I had no idea which syntax I needed to do what I wanted. It was quite hard at first, and it took me a few days of frustration to get familiar with it, but once I learned how to get around, I was able to create all the functionality of the plugin and refine it to exactly what I had in mind. TiggerSec was still there for when I needed extra guidance, and God knows I did. Big thanks to him for helping me make this plugin possible. If you want to get this plugin yourself, there's a link in the description to a download page. Simply download it and put it in the plugin folder of your OpenRCT2 folder. I totally just built this brand new coaster, and with this plugin I can really quickly see that the maximum price I can charge is first 18 euros, then 14, then 12 and so on. Charging 18 euros at first and lowering it later is optimal for making the most money, but it comes at the risk of forgetting to change it, and when you look at it again much later, suddenly realizing no one has been going on it for the past 6 months because it's too expensive now. For this reason, I quite like charging the third price down, as that means that it will be fine for 5 full years, longer than the duration of most scenarios. To be even more safe, you could already set it to the price that it would be if there are multiple of this ride type in the park, just in case you build more in the future. For this mine train coaster, that would be 9 euros. For those of you who are playing RCT Classic or the original RCT1 or 2 and thus cannot use this plugin, there are some rules of thumb you can use. A popular one is charging the same as the excitement rating, which in the case of this mine train coaster would be 6.6 euros. I have checked a whole bunch of rides and found that with most big tracked rides, the maximum ticket price for the first 5 years while also having another ride of the same type in the park is usually a few euros higher than the excitement rating. So setting it to that rating is pretty safe and will rarely lead to charging too much. You could also charge a few bucks more if you want. You can of course also just use the method of increasing the ticket price until it's too high. This is not only quite fun and will make you surprised by how much you can charge for some rides, but it also builds an intuition of what you can charge for different rides with different stats, which is handy for when you don't want to or cannot use the calculator. It also just makes you more money, and when you have just a few big rides in the park, it's not that hard to keep up with lowering the prices either. If you really want to optimize it, you could use a plugin called the Price Manager. This one is made by Sadrat, and it can automatically update the prices of all your rides to the maximum guests will pay. To me, this feels a little bit cheaty to use in everyday play, as setting and managing the prices of your rides is also a part of the game. But sometimes when I really want to optimize to the max, it is great fun to use this plugin. It can also set the prices of your shops and park entry, as well as implement a lazy tax for your ride prices if you want to punish yourself for being lazy and automating this part of the game. Since rides lose value as they get older, their profit also goes down, which isn't good. In order to keep being able to charge a higher ticket price, it's often worth the money to renew the ride by deleting and replacing it. This can be a bit tricky though with tracked rides, especially if they go underground, since you cannot build a safe design partially underground. Therefore, OpenRCT2 added the refurbish button, which renews a ride for the same cost as selling and rebuilding it without actually having to do that. In casual play, this is hardly ever necessary, but if you really want to optimize, then renewing your moneymakers every 13 or even every 5 months is a good idea. Okay, so we got the strategy of what to charge for your rides, but now the question becomes, what kind of ride will actually make you a lot of money? First, the obvious. Most roller coasters are great money makers. Yes, they do cost quite a bit to construct, but they tend to have both high stats, resulting in a high maximum ticket price, and an ability to process up to a few thousand guests per hour. Of course, some are better than others, with high capacity coasters like the Twister and vertical drop coasters being among the very best. But even the worst coaster type in the game, the mini suspended coaster, can make decent money. This one has a throughput of about 1100 guests per hour and a maximum ticket price of €9.80 despite already being 3 years old. With those stats, it still outperforms every flat ride in the game, so unless you make your coaster so small that it fails stat requirements and gets terrible stats, it will be a good moneymaker. However, there is still a big difference between different roller coasters, and it's mainly that, for once, smaller is better. A big roller coaster will make you a lot of money, but it's also expensive to build. A smaller roller coaster has a lower ticket price, but usually not that much lower, so if you have enough guests to feed both of them, 2 smaller coasters are usually more efficient than 1 big coaster. As mentioned before, the Log Flume, River Rapids and Splash Boats are also fantastic moneymakers, as they are quite cheap to build and tend to have a high maximum ticket price. 2 other great moneymakers are the Roto Drop and Launched Freefall. They are very cheap, require very little space and have a ridiculously high maximum ticket price. The Launched Freefall specifically is a very common ride in speedrunning for when you need to make a lot of money very quickly, precisely due to the aforementioned factors. If you need a quick buck, then most ride types under 5 months old can make you a decent amount. For example, these 3 pirate ships each have a ticket price of €7.40 and together they make me about €2,800 a month, which is not insignificant. Gentle rides like the Haunted House work too. They make a little bit less, but they're still pretty good. You only really don't want to rely on very low throughput ones like the merry-go-round, Ferris wheel and especially the space rings. One ride type that seems great but actually isn't is the go-karts. Yes, you can charge an absolute ton for them and they often have a full queue line, making them seem very popular, but actually the main reason that queue line fills up so quickly is that it has a terrible throughput. A very small design may still do alright, but any sizable one that does more than a single lap will quickly head towards the throughput numbers of the space rings, and that's not a good thing. You don't always want to charge a lot for your ride though. Doing this will make your guests go broke very quickly, as they rarely spawn with more than €100 and often with even just 40 or 50. This is fine if you have cash machines, as that allows them to fill up indefinitely, but sometimes it's not available, making the guests go broke and home very quickly. It comes up fairly regularly that I see someone asking why they cannot get enough guests to beat a certain scenario, and the problem is simply that their guests are running out of money and leaving the park. So if suddenly you are losing guests and don't see anything wrong with the park, click on a few of them and check whether they have simply run out of money. If that's the problem, you should lower your ticket prices. Now, as I hinted at earlier, there is a way to get guests to pay more than the usual maximum ticket price. You do this by having them ride a ride that doesn't have its stats calculated yet, as this makes them skip the price checks entirely, allowing you to always charge €20. Of course, as soon as they ride it, the ride will get tested and will get stats, so if you want to keep doing this, you will have to double close and reopen the ride before it finishes a run after every time it departs. And when it gets its stats calculated even just once, it will never work again on that ride, even if you do reset the stats. It's completely impractical to do this on any large scale, but it is fun to play around with. There is also a positive thought that guests can get from the ride ticket price, and that is this ride is really good value. They get this if they go on a ride where the ticket price is less than a quarter of the maximum ticket price. This does help a bit, as getting this thought increases their happiness slightly, but it's not always worth going for. If you're keeping your ride prices low to keep the guests in the park, then putting them in this range might be worth it. But if you do have the cash machine available or have another reason for charging as much as possible, then this thought is pretty much useless. Even this small park can already make more than 2,000 euros a month if you maximize all the ticket prices. By going for that thought, you lose more than 1,500 euros of ride ticket income, which is money that could be used on hiring 20 entertainers instead, which provide many times more happiness and still leave you with more money left over. Despite this, there is sometimes a reason to make a few rides free, even if you have the cash machine available. A guest that is going home will never go on any rides, with the exception of free transport rides. They won't seek them out, but when any guest bumps into the queue line of a free transport ride, even if they're going home, they will always join that queue if possible. This means that guests will be able to leave areas only accessible by transport rides, such as this bit in the Rainbow Summit scenario. It's still a bad idea to have sections without a path connection for other reasons, but at least they won't get stuck here trying to go home. You can also use it for guest distribution. Build a big free monorail with an entrance station near the park entry and an exit station on the other side of the park, and a lot of guests will quickly be transported off to the back of your park. And that's everything there is to say. To summarize, the maximum ticket price is based on the excitement, intensity and nausea stats of the ride. It goes down as the ride gets older, and it gets penalized when there are multiple of the same type in the park and when a guest has already paid for the park entrance. For 8 years, RCT2 has used a different calculation that made new rides with low stats worth significantly less, but that has been reverted now. To help you figure out what you can charge, I made a plugin that calculates this for you, and there's also a different one that automatically sets the prices for you. But if you want to do it all yourself without any help, then charging the same as the excitement rating is a good rule of thumb. However, you don't always want to charge the maximum, as that can make guests go broke and leave the park very quickly if cash machines are not available. And lastly, guests always go on free transport rides. When I originally made this video, I had my mom do the outro, but now that video is gone and so is that outro. That's a real shame. So, with a very big thank you for all the support in the past, currently and in the future, hopefully, here she is once more.
Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.